Welcome, curious minds, to the deep dive.
Yeah.
There's this phrase you hear thrown around a lot, especially with ancient history, the fall of the Greek Empire.
Right.
And it sounds so neat, doesn't it? So definitive, like one big thing that just poof, collapsed.
It absolutely does. And that neatness, well, it often papers over centuries of incredibly complex, messy, and fascinating history. It kind of implies this single, solid empire that suddenly crumbled.
Which isn't really the story at all, is it?
Not even close, actually.
So today, that's exactly what we're going to tackle. We're challenging that simple idea. We want to unpack the much more nuanced reality behind the fall or maybe falls of Greek power.
Right.
You've given us some really interesting sources. And for listeners trying to get their heads around this, what are the two main periods our sources focus on where we see these big shifts, these declines in Greek power?
Okay, so the sources really point to two very distinct eras. First, there are the Hellenistic Kingdoms. These are the powerful states that emerged after Alexander the Great's conquests sort of broke apart. Think Ptolemaic Egypt, the Seleucids.
Okay, that Hellenistic period. Got it.
Exactly. And then jump forward quite a bit, centuries later, and we look at the Byzantine Empire. This was essentially the continuation of the Roman Empire, but in the East, and it became very Greek in its language and culture, Orthodox Christian.
Often called the Empire of the Greeks. Right?
So, precisely. So two separate major phases of Greek political power, each with its own unique story of decline.
So our mission today is to dig into these sources, pull out the key insights, and really dissect the processes behind these declines. We're talking multiple causes, key turning points, and the lasting consequences that genuinely reshape the world. It's about getting you that comprehensive analysis.
Yeah, it's not just about what happened, but really digging into the why and the so what.
Yeah.
How did these distinct historical paths unfold? And how do they shape how we understand Greek influence even today?
Okay, so before we dive into those specific declines, let's tackle that phrase head on, Greek Empire. Because when we talk about ancient Greece, for most of its history, we're not actually talking about a single unified empire like Rome or Persia, are we?
That's such a crucial starting point. No, absolutely not. For most of the classical period, ancient Greece was fundamentally a civilization of hundreds of independent city-states. The polis, as they call it.
Polis.
Yeah, that was the basic unit. Think Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, hundreds of them, all pretty much self-governing from the archaic period, say 800 BC onwards. So no single Greek empire in that sense. They were fiercely independent.
So even when Athens was super powerful, like with the Delian League, that wasn't quite an empire in the Roman style. I always pictured it as this Athenian empire dominating everyone.
That's a really common picture, but it's more nuanced. The Delian League, especially in the 5th century BC, was more like a hegemonic alliance is a good term.
Yeah.
Athens was definitely the boss, using its navy to dominate.
Right. Calling the shots.
Exactly. Collecting tribute, influencing policy. But it wasn't a centrally administered empire controlling vast territories directly like Rome did. The underlying structure, the ideal at least, was still based on these independent city-states, even if Athens was strongly encouraging their cooperation. It kept that distinct flavor of Greek politics.
Okay, so mostly independent city-states, then this Athenian dominance, which was more like a powerful alliance. When did we first see something closer to actual unification across Greece? Was that Philip II of Macedon, Alexander's father?
Yes, that's the big shift. Philip II, king of Macedon in the mid-4th century BC, basically conquered or brought most of the Greek mainland under his control between 338 and his death in 323 BC.
So that was the end of the independent city-state era, effectively.
Pretty much, yeah. It marked a fundamental change. And it's worth noting, this Macedonian dominance was deeply resented by many Greeks who cherished their traditional autonomy.
And then comes his son, Alexander, and boom! Suddenly, an empire stretching from Greece to India. This is probably what pops into most people's minds when they hear Greek Empire, right? That explosive but short period.
Absolutely. Alexander created something unprecedented, an empire across 3 continents, spreading Greek language, culture, ideas, what we call Hellenistic civilization far and wide. But here's the kicker.
It didn't last.
It was incredibly short-lived. Alexander dies young in 323 BC, and his empire just fractures almost instantly.
Right, I remember reading about the chaos after his death. His generals just started fighting each other.
Immediately, they're called the Diadochi, the successors.
Yeah.
And they plunged into decades of brutal, destructive wars, the successor wars, carving up the empire for themselves. These weren't small border disputes, they were massive conflicts.
So that huge Greek empire under Alexander was basically a blip. It wasn't a stable, lasting thing at all.
Exactly. It illustrates perfectly that a unified Greek political structure covering that vast area wasn't sustainable, at least not then. It fragmented immediately, showing that these imperial phases were either very brief, like Alexander's, or, as we'll see, divided into competing kingdoms.
Which leads us nicely into those Hellenistic kingdoms. These were the big successor states that emerged from that fragmentation.
That's right. The major players that emerged were Ptolemaic Egypt, based in Alexandria, the Antigonid dynasty ruling Macedon, the Greek heartland, Lysimachus, briefly holding Thrace and parts of Asia Minor, and the huge Seleucid Empire, founded by Seleucus Aphanicator, stretching across the Near East.
And this whole period, the Hellenistic Age, when exactly was that?
Generally, we define it from Alexander's death in 323 BC, right up until Rome annexes the last major kingdom, Ptolemaic Egypt, in 30 BC, so roughly 3 centuries.
And even though the empire was politically fragmented, culturally this was a huge period, wasn't it? Greek idea spreading everywhere.
Immense. Culturally, it was an explosion. Greek philosophy, science, art, language, they spread throughout the Mediterranean and the Middle East. New cities like Alexandria and Antioch became massive centers of learning and culture.
So the political structure fragments, but the cultural influence actually expands.
Precisely. And this is where we start seeing that crucial difference between a political fall and cultural endurance. Greek culture wasn't dying. It was adapting, spreading, interacting with other cultures, and leaving this incredibly deep mark.
Okay, fascinating. So that's one major period of fall or transformation we'll dig into. But then you mentioned the Byzantine Empire. Fast forward hundreds of years. How does that fit in? Why is its decline considered a separate story in our sources?
Right, so the Byzantine Empire is a whole different beast, really. It starts much later. Essentially, it's the continuation of the Roman Empire, but specifically the eastern half, headquartered in its new capital, Constantinople, founded by Emperor Constantine around 330 AD.
So Roman initially, but it became Greek.
Over time, yes, it gradually transformed. Greek became the main language of administration and daily life. Its culture became heavily Hellenized, and its identity deeply tied to Orthodox Christianity. So much so that people in Western Europe often just called it the Empire of the Greeks.
And the time scale is just mind-boggling compared to the Hellenistic kingdoms. It lasted for, what, over 1,000 years?
Over a millennium, from the 4th century AD right up to 1453 CE. It weathered incredible storms, invasions, plagues, internal revolts. Its longevity is staggering.
So completely different context, different time frame.
Totally. And that's why our sources treat them as distinct. As that table 1 laid out visually, these are separate entities with separate endpoints. We're looking at 2 distinct long declines, not one single collapse. Trying to lump them together just misses the whole picture.
Okay, that framing is incredibly helpful. So, with that understanding of 2 distinct periods, let's dive into part 2. The decline and fall, or maybe absorption is a better word, of those Hellenistic kingdoms. This wasn't sudden, right? More like a slow squeeze by Rome.
Absorption is a great way to put it. It was definitely a gradual process, a relentless erosion of their power and independence, culminating in them being swallowed up by Rome. This unfolded over about 2 centuries, roughly the 3rd to the 1st centuries BCE.
Key moments being...
Well, Rome conquering the Greek mainland in 146 BC is a huge one, and then the final nail in the coffin is the annexation of Ptolemaic Egypt in 30 BC. But it was a long, drawn-out affair before that.
So what made them vulnerable? What were the internal weaknesses? It sounds like maybe the way they were born out of conflict kind of doomed them from the start.
That's a big part of it, yeah. The very foundation of these kingdoms was built on the rivalry and ambition of Alexander's generals. The successor war set a really damaging precedent for constant internal conflict.
They just couldn't stop fighting each other.
Pretty much. The major kingdoms, Ptolemaic Egypt, the Seleucid Empire, the Antigonids and Macedon, were constantly plagued by dynastic disputes, civil wars, court intrigue. It wasn't just occasional trouble, it was almost baked into the system. And this constant infighting just bled them dry.
Bled them dry? How? What was the real impact of all that instability? Can you give an example?
We'll take Ptolemaic Egypt. They had numerous civil wars, often brother against sister, uncle against nephew, fighting over the throne. This weakened them massively, drained the treasury, and made it super easy for Rome to meddle back one side against the other.
Pulling them off each other.
Exactly. And the Seleucid Empire, which was enormous, faced constant rebellions in places like Bactria, Parthia, Asia Minor. They were always fighting just to hold on to territory, losing chunks here and there. It was this recurring pattern of self-inflicted wounds, internal divisions, constantly creating openings for rivals or external powers like Rome.
And beyond the political chaos, what about the economy? Did all this warfare wreck their finances too?
Absolutely. Constant warfare is incredibly expensive. It drained their treasuries, yes, but it also meant damage to infrastructure, roads, irrigation, ports, which disrupted trade and agriculture, the absolute foundations of their economies.
So, less money coming in, more money going out on armies.
Right. And sometimes the pressure was direct. After the Seleucids lost to Rome, they had to pay these massive war indemnities, huge sums of silver. It crippled them financially, forced them to do unpopular things like raiding temples for cash.
Ouch. That wouldn't win you many friends.
No. And in places like Ptolemaic Palestine, you had this system of tax farmers, private individuals, who paid the government for the right to collect taxes, and then often squeezed the population for everything they could get. This created huge social tension between the ruling elite and the ordinary people.
So, economic hardship fueling social unrest.
Yes. And while there was an initial boom using the Persian gold Alexander had captured, eventually Roman economic power started to dominate. Roman silver currency became the standard. Rome could also use its wealth strategically, offering aid that came with strings attached, further undermining the independence of these kingdoms. It was economic vulnerability opening the door for political influence.
And on top of the infighting and economic problems, they were ruling over diverse populations. Did that cause issues? Rebellions from conquered peoples?
Constantly. Uprisings by subject peoples were a regular feature. The Maccabean revolt in Judea against the Seleucids is probably the most famous example of major sustained resistance.
Right, the Hanukkah story.
That's the one. And more generally, you often had a Greek or Macedonian ruling class sitting on top of large native populations, like in Egypt. The locals were often excluded from real power, treated as second-class citizens. That breeds resentment, instability, makes governance much harder, and drains resources, putting down revolts.
So, okay, internally they're unstable, economically strained, facing rebellions. It sounds like they were ripe for the picking by a rising external power, and that power was Rome.
It was. Rome was expanding, getting more powerful, more organized, and inevitably it came into conflict with the Hellenistic Kingdoms, especially Macedon and the Seleucids.
And Rome was clever about it, not just brute force.
Very clever. Rome became masterful at playing the Hellenistic states off against each other. They'd intervene in disputes, support one side, then another, always aiming to prevent any single Hellenistic kingdom from getting too strong. It was a deliberate balance of power strategy, designed to keep everyone weak relative to Rome, divide and conquer, essentially.
And when it came to actual fighting, Rome usually won.
Overwhelmingly. Roman legions proved consistently superior in organization, discipline, and tactics compared to most Hellenistic armies, which often relied more on elephants or cavalry charges that the Romans learned how to counter. Victories in the Macedonian Wars and the Syrian War against the Seleucids weren't just wins, they demonstrated Roman military dominance.
And then they didn't just leave, they took over.
Systematically. They annexed territories, turned kingdoms into Roman provinces, installed governors, collected taxes. It was a gradual but relentless process of absorption.
So military might combined with smart diplomacy.
Absolutely. Rome was also very skilled at using diplomacy and alliances. They'd make treaties, establish some rulers as client kings, technically allies, but really subordinate to Rome. This expanded their influence without always needing direct conquest.
And the Hellenistic kingdoms, they couldn't just unite against Rome.
That was their fatal flaw. They were too busy fighting each other, too caught up in their own rivalries and interests. They simply couldn't form a united front. That made it easy for Rome to pick them off one by one. It was this internal division versus Roman unity and strategic focus.
Let's trace that Roman encroachment through some key events. The Macedonian Wars seem like a major chapter.
Definitely. This was a series of conflicts that really broke the back of the Antigonid kingdom in Macedon. They got entangled with Rome partly because they sided with Hannibal during the Punic Wars.
Bad move.
Turned out to be, yes. After a couple earlier wars, the Third Macedonian War, 171 to 168 BCE, was decisive. The Battle of Pydna was a crushing Roman victory. King Perseus was captured, the dynasty ended, and Macedon was effectively under Roman control, divided up initially and later made a province. That fundamentally shifted the power dynamic in Greece.
Okay, so Macedon dealt with. What about the Seleucids, the big power in the east?
That was the Roman-Seleucid War, mainly fought between 192 and 188 BCE. The key battle was Magnesia in 190 BCE, where the Romans decisively defeated Antiochus III the Great.
Another major Roman victory.
Huge. The resulting Treaty of Apamea forced Antiochus to pay that massive indemnity we mentioned, abandon all his territory in Asia Minor north of the Taurus Mountains, and basically gutted Seleucid power in the west. They were still a large empire further east, but no longer a major player in the Mediterranean world.
So Rome is just slicing off pieces, weakening them financially. Then we get to 146 BCE. That year sounds important, the Achaean War, Corinth destroyed.
146 BC is a truly pivotal year. The Achaean League, a sort of federation of Greek city-states trying to maintain some independence, defied Rome. Rome's response was swift and brutal.
The Battle of Corinth.
Yes, a complete Roman victory. And then they made an example of Corinth. The city was utterly destroyed, its treasures looted, its people killed or sold into slavery.
Just wiped off the map.
Pretty much. It was a terrifying message to the rest of Greece. Resistance is futile. That year really marks the formal end of Greek political independence. Greece effectively became a Roman province, governed from Macedon initially.
Wow. And the last piece to fall was Egypt.
Ptolemaic Egypt, yes. It managed to hang on longer, partly because it was rich and somewhat isolated, but it was plagued by internal strife and increasingly became a Roman client state. Its fate got tied up in the Roman civil wars.
Cleopatra, Antony, Octavian.
Exactly. After Octavian, later Augustus, defeated Antony and Cleopatra at Actium, he moved on Egypt. Cleopatra's death in 30 BCE marked the end. Egypt was annexed, becoming a personal province of the Roman emperor, and that's widely seen as the final end of the Hellenistic era.
So, politically, total absorption into Rome. What about the wider consequences? Economically, culturally, did Greek influence just disappear under Roman rule?
Politically, yes, complete loss of independence. They became parts of the Roman administrative machine. Economically, Roman rule brought a kind of integration across the Mediterranean, which could boost trade in some ways, but fundamentally economic power shifted to Rome.
Roman coins, Roman taxes.
Roman standards, Roman control. You also saw the growth of large estates, often worked by slaves captured in wars, which changed the social structure. Wealth got concentrated in Roman hands or local elites who collaborated with Rome.
But the culture. Did Rome just erase Greek culture?
Now that's the fascinating part. No, quite the opposite in many ways. This is where that political fall versus cultural endurance really comes into play. Roman elites were hugely influenced by Greek culture.
They admired.
Deeply. They adopted Greek philosophy, literature, rhetoric, art, architecture. Wealthy Romans hired Greek tutors for their children, sent them to study in Athens. Roman art often copied Greek originals.
So Rome actually helped spread Greek culture.
In a way, yes. Rome absorbed Hellenistic culture and then, through its own vast empire, spread a version of it, this blend we call Greco-Roman culture, all over Western Europe and North Africa. It became foundational for Western civilization.
But it wasn't purely Greek anymore. There was a Roman element mixed in.
Exactly. It was a fusion. And over time, Roman law, Roman administration, the Latin language in the West, these also spread among the elites in the former Hellenistic lands. So while Greek culture spread, a distinct political Greek identity gradually faded as people became integrated into the Roman system, accepting Roman rule and adopting Roman ways alongside Greek ones. It's complex.
Okay, so that covers the Hellenistic kingdoms, a gradual absorption by a rising Rome. Politically decisive, but culturally transformative. Now, let's leap forward again, over a millennium, to the Byzantine Empire, part 3. This sounds like a very different kind of decline, much longer, more drawn out.
Oh, absolutely. A completely different dynamic. The Byzantine decline was this incredibly long, slow burn, spanning several centuries, really intensifying from around the 11th century until a final collapse in 1453.
And unlike the Hellenistic states facing one main rival, Rome, Byzantium was fighting on multiple fronts.
Exactly. It wasn't a systematic absorption by one rising power. It was more like death by 1,000 cuts. A devastating combination of severe internal weaknesses and relentless simultaneous pressures from a whole range of external enemies. It was an attrition warfare on a grand scale.
Okay, let's break that down. Starting with the internal problems, the self-inflicted wounds, as the sources call them, civil war seems to pop up again.
Constantly and catastrophically. Byzantine history is riddled with civil wars. These weren't just minor succession squabbles. They were often large-scale, incredibly destructive conflicts that tore the empire apart.
What was the impact?
It crippled them. Armies meant to be fighting external enemies were fighting each other. Treasuries were empty, paying troops in civil wars. It prevented any kind of unified response to threats. Think about the period right after the disaster at Manzikert in 1071. Instead of uniting, they had about a decade of revolts and civil war. It was madness.
Any other examples that really stand out?
The 14th century was particularly brutal. Two major prolonged civil wars, 1321 to 1128 and 1341-47. While the Byzantines were fighting each other, the Ottoman Turks were consolidating their hold in Anatolia and started to push into the Balkans. And the Serbian Empire, under Stefan Dušan, just carved off huge chunks of territory. The nobles were more interested in grabbing power for themselves than saving the empire.
And presumably all this fighting hammered the economy, too.
Devastatingly. The Byzantine economy went into a long, slow decline. They lost control of key trade routes to rising powers like Venice and Genoa. The agricultural base, especially after losing Anatolia, shrank dramatically.
And how did the government cope? Or fail to cope?
They often resorted to really heavy taxation to fund the army and bureaucracy, which made life miserable for ordinary people and reduced loyalty. Corruption was also a massive problem, officials skimming off the top, weakening institutions.
And those concessions to the Italians you mentioned, Venice and Genoa?
Oh, those were disastrous in the long run. Starting around the 11th, 12th centuries, emperors granted huge trading privileges to the Italian maritime republics, often in exchange for naval help. But this ended up giving Venice and Genoa almost total control over Byzantium's foreign trade.
They basically outsourced their economy.
In a way, yes. And the Italians reaped the benefits. There's a staggering statistic from the mid-14th century. The Byzantine state was collecting only about 13% of the customs duties from trade going through the Bosphorus, right past Constantinople. The Genoese, from their colony just across the water, were collecting vastly more.
Wow. That's crippling.
It starved the state of revenue. Add in things like debasing the currency, reducing the amount of gold or silver in coins, and rampant inflation, and the economic foundations just crumbled.
And the military, the famous Byzantine army, did that crumble too?
It did. The old system, the theme system, where provinces provided local soldiers who defended their own areas, decayed from the 11th century on. This was closely linked to the loss of Anatolia, its main recruiting ground.
So what did they replace it with?
Increasingly expensive and often unreliable foreign mercenaries. You hear stories like thousands of mercenaries deserting just before or during the Battle of Manzikert. Not exactly ideal.
Doesn't sound reliable at all.
No. And there was just general neglect. Not enough investment in the army, in border defenses, in adapting to new kinds of warfare. By the 13th century, the army was tiny compared to its heyday. And they couldn't even afford their own navy anymore, relying almost entirely on the Venetians or Genoese, which gave those Italians even more leverage.
It sounds like a downward spiral. And were there social or religious problems adding fuel to the fire?
Definitely. Religious disputes could be incredibly divisive. Earlier controversies like iconoclasm left deep scars. Later, a huge issue was the attempt to unite the Orthodox Church with the Catholic Church.
Why did they try to do that?
Mostly desperation. Emperors hoped that by agreeing to papal supremacy, they could get significant military aid from Western Europe against the Turks.
Did it work?
Militarily, not really. And internally, it was a disaster. Most Byzantines, especially the clergy and ordinary people, fiercely opposed the union. They saw it as a betrayal of their Orthodox faith. It caused riots, deep social divisions, and further weakened internal cohesion at critical moments.
So another internal fracture.
Yes. And sometimes religious policy had direct military consequences. For instance, the Byzantines often persecuted Armenians because they followed a different branch of Christianity, monophysitism. This led to distrust and policies that actually disarmed Armenian regions or disbanded Armenian military units, leaving the eastern frontier much more vulnerable, particularly before Manzikert.
Okay, so internally, Byzantium was weakening significantly, politically, economically, militarily, socially. Now, let's look at the external pressures. You said it was like a siege from all sides.
It really was. Unlike the Hellenistic kingdoms facing mainly Rome, Byzantium faced a bewildering array of enemies, often simultaneously from different directions.
And the Turks were central to this story.
Absolutely central, especially in the long run. First, the Seljuk Turks burst onto the scene in the 11th century. Their victory at Manzikert led to the loss of most of Anatolia, the empire's heartland. That was a body blow.
And then the Ottomans?
As Seljuk power faded, the Ottomans emerged from northwestern Anatolia and became Byzantium's greatest and final adversary, as one source puts it. They were incredibly organized, disciplined, and relentless. They systematically chipped away at Byzantine territory.
And they crossed into Europe.
Yes, the capture of Gallipoli in 1354 gave them a permanent base in the Balkans. From there, they expanded rapidly, surrounding Byzantium. They also became masters of siege warfare, crucially adopting gunpowder and cannons, which eventually made Constantinople's famous walls obsolete.
So the Turks were the main event, but you also mentioned the Crusaders. Weren't they supposed to be helping?
Ah, the Crusaders. That's one of the great tragic ironies. The First Crusade was actually called in response to a Byzantine plea for help after Manticore.
But it backfired.
In many ways, yes. While the First Crusade did help recover some territory initially, subsequent Crusaders often had their own agendas. They frequently refused to return conquered lands to the Byzantines as promised, setting up their own states instead. And the commercial rivalry, especially with Venice, poisoned relations.
Leading up to the Fourth Crusade.
The Fourth Crusade, 1202-1204, was an absolute catastrophe for Byzantium. It was diverted, largely by Venetian manipulation, from fighting Muslims in the Holy Land to attacking Christian Constantinople instead.
They sacked their own allies.
They did, brutally. They captured the city, looted its incredible wealth, desecrated churches, and dismembered the empire, setting up a Latin empire ruled by Western knights.
Is that the end?
Not quite. Byzantine successor states fought back and eventually recaptured Constantinople in 1261, but the damage was immense. Many historians see the Fourth Crusade as the fatal blow. The restored empire was a shadow of its former self, impoverished, weakened, its prestige shattered, and deeply distrustful of the West. It never truly recovered.
Just unbelievable. Were there other enemies nibbling away as well?
Oh, yes. In the West, you had the Normans, who conquered Byzantium's last Italian territories around 1071 and even invaded the Balkans multiple times. To the north, Bulgaria re-emerged as a powerful kingdom in the late 12th century, leading to centuries of conflict. And in the 14th century, the Serbian Empire under Stefan Dusan took advantage of Byzantine civil wars to conquer huge swaths of the Balkans, Macedonia, Thessaly, Epirus.
So literally surrounded and shrinking.
Exactly. Attacked from north, south, east, and west, often simultaneously, while also tearing itself apart from within. It was an impossible situation in the long run.
Let's pinpoint some of those key events that marked this long decline. Manzikert, 1071. You said that was the true beginning of the end.
It's often seen that way, yes.
Yeah.
The defeat itself was bad, the emperor captured, but the real catastrophe was the aftermath. The civil war it triggered, and the resulting rapid loss of Anatolia. Losing that vast, rich region, the main source of soldiers, food, and taxes, was a wound the empire arguably never recovered from.
Then, about a century later, Myriokephalon, 1176. Another defeat to the Seljuks.
Yes. Emperor Manuel Ikomnenos tried a major campaign to push the Seljuks back in Anatolia, but his army was ambushed and badly defeated. While not as devastating territorially as Manzikert, it effectively ended serious Byzantine hopes of reconquering central Anatolia. It was a huge psychological blow, too, marking the end of the Komnenian Restoration, the last period of significant Byzantine resurgence.
And then 1204, the sack of Constantinople by the Fourth Crusade, the fatal blow.
Undeniably. The sheer destruction, the looting of centuries of accumulated wealth, the political fragmentation into Latin and Byzantine successor states, it crippled the empire fundamentally. Even after getting the capital back in 1261, it was never the same power again.
Fast forward again, 1354, the Ottomans take Gallipoli. You called this the point of no return?
Many historians do. When the Ottomans established a permanent foothold in Europe at Gallipoli, they could bypass Constantinople and expand directly into the Balkans. It also meant they could attack Constantinople from both sides. The Byzantines were powerless to stop them. From that point on, the strategic situation was basically hopeless. It was just a matter of time.
And that time ran out in 1453, the final fall of Constantinople.
The end of the line. Sultan Mehmed II besieged the city with a huge army and, crucially, massive cannons that battered the ancient Theodosian walls. After a long siege, the Ottomans broke through, the last emperor died fighting, and the city fell.
The end of a thousand-year empire.
The definitive end of the Byzantine Empire, and with it, the last living remnant of the Roman Empire. A truly world-changing event.
So the immediate consequence. Byzantium gone, the Ottoman Empire ascendant?
Absolutely, total collapse. The Ottomans took over, Constantinople became their capital, Istanbul. They now controlled the vital Bosphorus Strait, a strategic choke point, and had a springboard for further expansion into Europe, the Middle East, North Africa.
What was the impact on the rest of Europe, on Christendom?
It was seen as a massive blow, a disaster. This great Christian empire in the East, which had acted as a buffer for centuries, was gone. It created a lot of fear in Europe about Ottoman expansion.
But you mentioned this paradox earlier, the fall actually helping to spark the Renaissance. How did that work?
It's fascinating. As the empire crumbled, and especially after 1453, many Byzantine scholars fled westward, particularly to Italy. They brought with them their knowledge of classical Greek language and literature, and crucially, they brought physical manuscripts, works of Plato, Aristotle, historians, scientists, many of which had been lost or forgotten in Western Europe during the Middle Ages.
So, a direct transfer of knowledge.
Yes. This influx of texts and scholars gave a huge boost to the revival of classical learning that was already underway, feeding directly into the intellectual and artistic explosion of the Renaissance. Also, the fall disrupted traditional trade routes to the east, which pushed Europeans like the Portuguese and Spanish to seek new sea routes, leading into the age of exploration.
So, the end of one era helped kickstart another. And what about the Byzantine legacy within the Ottoman Empire itself? Did the Ottomans just erase everything?
Not at all. That's another fascinating layer. The Ottomans, while conquerors, were also pragmatic rulers. They adopted many Byzantine administrative practices, legal concepts, court ceremonies, even architectural styles. Hagia Sophia became a mosque, but the structure itself heavily influenced Ottoman mosque design. In many ways, the Ottoman Empire saw itself as inheriting the imperial mantle of Constantinople. The city remained an imperial capital, just under new management, absorbing and adapting the legacy of its predecessor.
This has been incredibly illuminating. We've gone from the idea of a single fall to understanding two very distinct, complex stories spanning centuries. So pulling it all together, what's the main takeaway when we compare the fall of the Hellenistic Kingdoms and the fall of Byzantium?
The main takeaway is just how different they were, driven by different internal flaws and facing different external threats. It really reinforces that there wasn't one fall of Greek power, but distinct endings to distinct phases.
Can you quickly contrast those internal weaknesses and external pressures again?
Sure. Hellenistic kingdoms were plagued by fragmentation right from the start, constant infighting among successors, making them vulnerable to a single, organized, rising power, Rome. Their decline was more of a systematic absorption.
Okay, internal division meeting external unity.
Right. Byzantium, on the other hand, lasted much longer, but decayed internally through chronic civil wars later on, severe economic mismanagement, military decline, and religious divisions. And crucially, it faced a multitude of relentless external enemies from all sides: Turks, Crusaders, Normans, Slavs. Its fall was more like a prolonged siege, an exhaustion, and attrition.
But in both cases, internal problems open the door for external forces.
Absolutely. That's a common thread. Internal weakness creates the opportunity for external pressure to become decisive. It's almost always a combination.
And maybe the most important point you've made is that neither of these political collapses meant the end of Greek culture.
That is the crucial distinction, I think. Political empires rise and fall, borders change. But the influence of Greek civilization, its ideas, its art, its way of thinking, that endured long after the political structures disappeared.
Through Rome, and then through Byzantium itself, even in its fall.
Exactly. Hellenistic culture shaped Rome, and Rome spread that Greco-Roman fusion across Europe. Byzantium preserved so much classical knowledge for 1,000 years, and then its collapse, ironically, helped reignite that knowledge in the West during the Renaissance. Culture proves remarkably resilient, often outlasting the empires that carry it.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? How do we define the end of a civilization? Is it when the state collapses? Or does it live on through its ideas, its cultural DNA, long after? What does that mean for how we see history, or even our own time?
That's the perfect question to ponder. It challenges us to look beyond just dates and battles and think about those deeper, more enduring legacies.
Well, this deep dive has certainly given us, and hopefully you, a much richer, more nuanced understanding, a real shortcut to getting informed beyond the simple headlines about the fall of the Greek Empire.
We hope it sparked your curiosity to perhaps explore some of these threads further, maybe the specifics of Byzantine influence on Ottoman administration or the cultural blend in Roman Egypt. There's always more to uncover.
Indeed. For the deep dive, thank you for joining us on this journey through the complex endings of Greek power. We'll see you next time.